Hello, everyone. We are so excited to be here today on our Here Developer live stream. This episode marks the first in a new series for Azure Connections, and I am joined today by our very famous Dr. Richard Süselbeck. So Richard, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the role that you have at Here?
I'm Richard. I have the same role as Michael. I'm a developer evangelist. Unlike Michael, I'm not based out of Phoenix. I'm based out of Berlin. This is my very first Twitch stream. I've been trying to get into the Twitch game for a while now, so I'm really excited to be here with you and to be able to kick off this exciting new series.
Yes, it's going to be really fun. I mean, I know everyone's going to enjoy some of the demos that we're going to do. So first of all, this is a live experience. So for all those who are viewing in, hello, nice to meet you. Feel free to interact with us in our chat, give suggestions, say hello. We're going to have some moderators in there. Richard will be moderating, and so will Nick Raboy, familiar from his Waypoint seasons. He's going to be moderating as well. And of course, we have Peter lurking in the background as Here Dev, and he might pop up and say a few things or share some links with you as well. Just one thing we like to share at the beginning of all of our live stream episodes is that if you happen to want to show some support for the show and want to donate to a good cause, any revenue from the subscriptions or bits are donated to CARE, an international relief fund, and there's more information on that on our channel page. So, Richard, I think we should now get started and talk about what we're going to be doing today. Are you ready?
Yes. What are we going to be doing today?
So this is completely designed as episode 1 of this new series of Azure Connections to welcome Azure developers to integrating location services into their development projects. Now, this first episode is going to be a walkthrough of how to do that with map images and map tiles. So we're going to walk through how they can actually get started, what some of their options are, and of course, how to integrate it with their Azure experience. So let's dive right into the code and start talking about the very first thing that we're going to be doing, and that is discussing what our JavaScript API is. Now, Richard, you probably see the code on the screen. This is a static HTML page. There's really nothing about Azure in this HTML document. I just wanted to let all the Azure developers know if you do happen to need a rich client in the web browser, this is option number 1. Use the JavaScript API. So as part of using the JavaScript API, you'll notice that all of these scripts plus this style sheet is included in the header section. And in addition to that, down here below, I have initialized an API key that's going to be used in a call or in some initialization in just a bit. And I've also created all these variables in this like M or module level, variable, so I could just do M dot to access everything. But here is all the information that we're going to need in order to start initializing a base map. Now this is done, but the first question would be this API key. Where should I get this, Richard? You've been around longer here than I have. Where would I go?
This is part of my job is telling people to go to developer.here.com, which is our developer portal. Right. And there's a big get started for free button, and you can hit that. And the sign up process is really quick. You just basically need your name and your email address. We don't need a credit card from you or anything. And once you've gotten through that and then clicked agree, you will be basically taking you to your projects page, yes, which you can click on right now. This is how you get there after signing up, and you can then set up a new project. Mm-hmm. And within that project, you have the ability to create your various sets of credentials. So for the JavaScript API, you can see right at the top there, you basically have to create an API key. And in this case, you would hit create key. Michael's already done that, so he's got one there. That would show up immediately for you. You can whitelist that against the domain, and that's really all you need to do.
Cool. So essentially, and like you said, it's such a simple process to get that started. Once you have that, you plug in your API key. Down below, it does an initialization of our platform. And by the way, all the code that you're going to be seeing today is going to be available on our GitHub for our live streams. So we'll be sharing that link at some point. But so don't feel like you have to screen scrape or take pictures. You're going to have all this code available for free at our GitHub. Let's see what this does, Richard. I have it right here. I'm just going to go ahead and go directly to this page. This is what it does. I have it set up right now so that when you zoom in and out, by the way, I did a massive accidental swipe on my mouse wheel, so that's why it went blank for a second. So I went way too quick. But here's my hometown of Phoenix. And of course, I'm using the new JavaScript API, which is kind of cool because if I go down, this is a version 3.1, maybe go kind of downtown and to this area, I could start to pan, our downtown area in a 3D view, which is a really cool thing to do. So again, this is using our newest API. And by the way, for those who would be saying, how is he doing that? I'm just using my mouse and holding down the Alt key. And when I hold down the Alt key, I can start to pan in this three dimensions. So that's pretty cool, right?
Yeah. And by the way, if you want to do that with code, there's a new function in the map view. I think it's called look at data, where you can set all that kind of information, zoom and rotation and tilt and incline. So you can do that with your mouse, or I think the newest release has support for mobile devices, touchscreens as well. But you can also do that in your code. I've done a lot of that. It's really with the new vector tiles and the JavaScript API. It's just a lot of fun to just rotate and zoom around the maps.
That is very nerdy of you to say. That is awesome.
I did a whole blog post, which is mostly just GIFs of me rotating the map around recently.
Right, which is cool. But anyway, again, this is the first episode of Azure Connections. And so far, you'd probably agree with me, we haven't seen anything about Azure so far. Is that right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Nothing. Now, the next thing I would like to demonstrate is something a little smaller. Notice that this entire HTML page fits on one screen, right? Just one screen. This is our Restful API call. And so what this means is instead of having an interactive map as we do in this web browser on the previous example, this is just returning a static web image. That's it, or I shouldn't even say web image, just an image of a map.
It's basically a JPEG that gets returned from the REST API.
That's correct.
I think you can also ask for a PNG if that's your thing.
That's true, and that is also nerdy for you to know. So what I would like to ask you, which would even be very cool, is for you to address what would be some scenarios where you would just need a static map and not an interactive map.
Well, there's a whole bunch of scenarios where that's useful. One thing, for example, if you've ever called a ride with an app or something, you usually get your receipt in an email, and very often that receipt will actually have a little image of a map and the route that you took, so you can look at that receipt and realize, oh, it's that ride, so that kind of makes sense. And obviously in emails you can't do interactive maps. All you can do is text and images and some formatting, and so that's a nice use case for that. Yeah. Or imagine you have an Amazon show, again, that has a screen. So if you have a skill that gets you some information, hey, where's my package? It'll can give you that verbally, but you can also throw an image on there. Again, that does not support interactive maps, but images you can show. So that's another nice use case where you can kind of track where your package is on something like that. There's a whole host of these kind of examples where an interactive map is actually too much, or an interactive map isn't really supported in the medium that you're looking at it.
Correct. So thanks for that. And so that, even though we're showcasing this in a web page, like Richard said, these RESTful calls could be very useful in multiple environments. So in this example, to make this RESTful call to our API, you'll notice that I've added an app ID and an app code. In the previous example, our SDK only needed what's called an API key. But I'm going to move back over to our screen here where we were in our project page and just scroll down, and you'll notice that under REST and XYZ Hub API CLI, this is where I would grab my app ID and app code. So those values are copied over. I go back over to my code, paste them in here. And again, I'm just doing some simple initialization. In this example, I'm constructing all the information that will be required for me to dynamically build this URL as we see on line 22. And would you like to see what it looks like?
Yes, please.
All right, so I'm going to...
From the latitude and longitude, I can already tell it's going to be a map of Berlin.
Ah, there you go. You're right. So this is our simple one of map. So now, Richard, I know that you, again, have quite the awesome nerdness in you. I would like you to go into, by the way, we're sharing in Visual Studio Code. What could you do that might make this a little more interesting? Just like one little thing that you could change in this code.
Yeah, as you can see, we got some fairly obvious things here. We've got the latitude and longitude. We've got the size of the image. We've got a zoom factor. And that sort of gets us a standard map. But if we basically just add another parameter, which is called T for type, map type, and we set that to 1, the default is 0, which is what we looked at. We set that to 1. I'm saving that, and you can maybe reload the page. Then we'll actually see. Try that again. Did I save? I saved.
Yeah, it looks saved.
It looks saved. I don't know what's going on.
Maybe try another type.
Okay, let me try 14. I'll save that again.
Okay.
Oh, I know what we completely forgot to actually add it to the URL at the end here. This can't possibly work.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
That's what developers do, is realize their own mistakes. So yeah. So what he's saying is he didn't add it into the construction of the URL.
Yeah. So here at the end, we actually have to add that parameter as well. And when we save it, then it should work.
Gotcha. So I'll refresh. So this is what number 1 looks like. So that's,
It's your satellite imagery, right? Very different type of map. And then there's a whole bunch of options. Let's move up to 14, maybe see what that looks like.
I'll refresh. Okay. Ooh, night view. Okay.
I think that's actually a night view optimized for pedestrians. I think at that zoom level, you can't really see the pedestrian optimization. I think mostly what that means is a lot of the information for cars is kind of removed from it. And it's a night view, so it's got a dark background. It doesn't blind you while you're using it. So there's a lot of these. It's kind of fun to play around with.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. So again, haven't seen the anything Azure yet. We have one more pit stop before we get into the Azure stuff. But what I'm building up to at this point is the ability for the developers to understand what kind of features they can be integrating into their Azure stuff. So one more little pit stop is going to be looking at our REST Map Tile. So I have this URL at the top, and I'm going to save this or copy it over to our browser. And I want you to see, in fact, I'll just go to our project page and just do it right here. What this is it's a link to our tutorial on how to use Leaflet with our APIs. Now, what Leaflet does is it works with tiles, map tiles, and gives that interactive type experience in a web browser without you actually having to have our SDK. So it's an alternative to our SDK, but still using our map tiles. So all this does is it says, okay, if you would like this, start off with something like a base HTML page, something like this with these references, and then go ahead and copy this into a script tag, put your own app ID and app code, and voila, you pretty much have this working with Leaflet. So if I go over back to our code example, like right here, basically that's what I did. I copied that code from that tutorial, put it in here, and I also integrated the information that was supposed to be at the top according to Leaflet's page, so it's slightly different than what was in the tutorial, but you can go to the Leaflet homepage under Get Started, and this is where you get those references. And using our API, as you can see here, I'm constructing the URL once again, and in order to just keep this really simple so we can get right to Azure, I just want you to see what this will look like in the browser. I'm going to go back over to our to the browser here and go over to here, Leaflet, and this is what it looks like. Nice tile API. These are our tiles coming from our API, but using the Leaflet rendering engine in the browser. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so in many ways, this is an alternate way to get that kind of interactive map experience if you don't want to use our JavaScript API, or if you've got a system already set up that uses Leaflet or some other engine that consumes tiles. And that's really what the Map Tile API is for anyway, right? It allows you to use our maps in essentially any kind of interactive map system, whether you've built it yourself or you're using some other tool like Leaflet.
Yes. So we've done the pitch of what we can do, and now what we'd like to demonstrate is essentially for those RESTful calls, those are the calls that either are to the map image or to the map tiles. How could this be done being called from an Azure function? And how can you do it quickly? So I'm going to move over now to another screen. This is azure.microsoft.com. And if you want it, first of all, in order to do this, and we're making this assumption that if you're an Azure developer, you already have an account. You've created your account here in Azure. So I'm signed in with my account. And now if I want to go to this marketplace, and specifically, I would want to go to the Azure marketplace. I have that already opened up in this link right here. And if I search in here for here, you can see some of the searches I've done in the past, but HERE and do a search. The one that I'm going to look for, Richard, is this one called Here Maps and Location Services. And I'm going to click on that. And that takes me to this page where it explains this template, if I get it, is going to create for me, on my behalf, the Azure functions necessary to call our core APIs. So I can call them from the Azure functions themselves. And if I click Get It Now, and then continue, it's going to take us over to that page where I could start the process of providing the required information in order to call these and have those Azure functions created. So I'm going to click Create. And I have to choose my resource group. You may have some that you already have. I'm just going to create a new one. I'm just going to call it, how do you spell your last name? S-U?
S. Well, I don't think you have that letter on your keyboard, so the alternative way of spelling it is with UE. That looks about right from here.
Looks good. Okay, so congratulations, you're a resource group. I'm going to say OK.
Finally, I've amounted to something.
And then I can add my here app ID and app code. So I already have those captured in my code. So I'm going to go over to my code file and take the app ID. Pardon. And go here. And also go back over to the code and grab the app code as well.
You see Michael in chat knows how that weird letter is called. That gets some bonus points from me.
Cool. And I'm going to click OK. And what that's going to do now is it's going to run a final validation on some things. It says OK, go ahead and continue with the process. Accept the terms of use. Is this my information? I'll say yes and create. And then you'll notice it's initializing the deployment up here. Now, that deployment can take a little while. And so kind of like what we discussed earlier, kind of like on these cooking episodes, where it's like, so we've done this stage of the cooking. Now we're going to kind of just move over in time to one that's already created.
On the German cooking shows, they always say, "Ich habe das hier schon mal vorbereitet," which basically means I've already prepared this. And then they move on to the other table.
Gotcha.
And skip through all of the hard parts, basically, that you wanted to know about.
Cool. So by the way, let me go back. I just clicked on that way too fast. I clicked on all my resources. So for all resources that I have, there's these, these various ones. And I want to make sure, because I've created a couple of these, I just want to take a sneak peek in the code to our Azure Map image and just make sure that I grab the right one. Yeah, this one here. This one's already created. What I'm clicking on is our app services that contain these functions. So as this is loading up, all these things in this app service with this unique ID is going to have all the functions that are created for us on our behalf when we deploy this template into our Azure environment. So I'm just waiting for this little spinner to finish so I can explore the functions, and there they are. These are all of our APIs. Now, of course, Richard, we're going to be focused primarily on map image and map tile. So I'm going to click on map image. And while this is loading up, what this is doing is it's actually showing me how this Azure function was written. And I have full access to it. This is one of the advantages of having this hosted in an Azure function is that, for starters, you can make sure that your credentials are now obfuscated from the client. So instead of having to put these in the client somewhere and manage it there, it's now being managed in this serverless function. And you'll notice that when we put the app ID and app code into the wizard as we were starting this up, it automatically puts them in environment variables. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Okay. The other advantage here is that this code can be changed. Now, we're not going to change it, but if you wanted to, you can change it, and that might make more sense in the next example we're going to show. But for right now, I just want everyone to see that this is basically the code that was written in order to call our API through this Azure function. Now, the important piece to keep in mind when you're going to be using these Azure functions as a RESTful call is notice this link at the top that says get function URL. I'm going to click on that. And when I do that, it's going to give me this long URL. I'm going to click copy here because I want that copied to the clipboard. And we're going to go examine it right now in Visual Studio Code. I'm going to go back over there and just right here, I think I'll create a little HTML comment and then just paste it right in there. And let me discuss it. And you'll see it kind of mirrors what's up there already because I already had something, up, but you could see what I had to change. For example, almost everything is the same up to where it says API/map image. And then inside what we copied from Azure, there's this little section called segments. And what that means is we're responsible now to place what would have gone right there in the URL after the base API or the core API was called. So to make that make more sense, I'm going to go to our REST map API. Do you see here how it has MIA16 map view?
That's basically the API endpoint, right? That's
the API endpoint. So now I'm going to go over to this one, and you can see that's all I did is after this area where it says API map image, segments is going to be, this is the equivalent of this up here, what we had already had in the previous screen. And then all the parameters that follow after that would follow on this line, all the options that we have, I should say. Now, the one thing that is different is you'll notice here that it also provides something called code. That code is what's necessary for us to call this API. The short story on this is that Azure developers have a lot of control as to how they want to have their Azure functions accessed. By default, you need to have this code, but there's other options that they can utilize. But just to make it clear, that code would be required unless you implement one of those options. So now that we have that discussed, let's go ahead and see what this looks like. Notice there's not even a script tag on this page. Literally, we're just putting the Azure URL to your Azure function for the map image right directly into the image tag. So I'm going to say,
because the map image API literally just returns a JPEG or a PNG, this is something you can actually do with it.
That's correct. So now going over to the Azure Map image, I'll go ahead and just refresh the screen, but that's it right there. Now, if you were going to go in there, Richard, and change, let's say, some coordinates behind the scenes in that URL, even just slightly, let me know when you're done with that and save it, and I'll just refresh the screen so we could show that this was no smoke and mirrors, and I had literally no idea what you're going to put in the coordinates, but I'll just, I'll find out.
So I mentioned earlier that the map image API is actually fairly powerful.
Right.
It gives you an image of a map, but it has a lot of other things in there as well. So I'm going into the code that Michael set up with our sharing here. I'm adding a little section of my own, and I'm saving this. And one of the things you can do is if you reload now.
Whoa.
You can see, you can, for example, you can add markers to it. You
so
can also.
Let's take a look at that code then.
Sure. Switch over to. You have to switch over to code, and you'll see I've basically just added here my little dinosaur emoji, so you know where my code starts, and then created a new image tag called image markers. And then it's the same way. You basically get the API endpoint here, and you get all the segments and all the parameters. In this case, really, I've just put in a few points of interest with lat longs. And actually, what it will automatically do is focus the map so that all the points of interest are in there. And then here I'm just setting the width and the height, and I'm adding the code like you did. And that's all it is. So this doesn't even need a lat long or a zoom level to center the map. It'll automatically make sure that all the map markers are in view.
So just to focus on that again, this POI that you put in here, this %2c is really a comma separated list. Would that be correct? Of all of these different lat longs. And when we go back over to the screen and take a look at it, each one of these markers is one of those coordinates that was provided. So it's a static image, but it also has markers on it where we wanted those markers to go.
Yeah, and you can also do this with polygons. So you can basically call the routing algorithm or a GPX trace or something, and then draw that on the map. For example, for the use case that we talked about earlier with the ride sharing, that would allow you to add a route to this, and this kind of works the same way. You add a list of lat longs to it, and say the parameter is called L or L1 for one line. You can add multiple lines. You can also add some styling. So it really is a kind of fairly powerful way to draw on that map as well.
You got another example?
Sure. I've added something else and I've saved it, and you can maybe reload.
So we'll reload. We'll take a look. Okay, so what we're looking at is New Delhi, but it looks like there's a faint green circle around that center point. So what is this?
Well, this is basically, if you've ever used a Maps app, it gives you a kind of a location where you are with kind of an uncertainty circle around it. And now this is basically a feature built into this API as well, where it can do more than just a marker. It can do this kind of proximity image. I've talked earlier about the Amazon example, right? You might be tracking one of your packages, and you might want to know where it is, and you might get that via your Amazon show. And obviously, whenever you get a location, be it from GPS or be it through wireless location positioning, you will always have a certain kind of proximity circle around it. Or maybe even the delivery company doesn't exactly want you to know where the truck is, so you can put this nice little uncertainty circle around it. And if we look at the code here, you'll actually see it kind of works the same way. We have a center here, as we had before. We have our width, we have our height, we have the code, and then you've already highlighted this here. This is the hue parameter. If you add this, you will add that little uncertainty circle in the middle with, in this case, 1,500 meters of uncertainty. Okay,
that's cool. All right, you got another one?
I have another example.
Let's see it.
While I copy that in, let me go here, and I've saved it. Hopefully I copied the right thing. Let's see if that works.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the comment didn't work, so we got some formatting issues. I'll just save again. Maybe you can reload. The little dinosaur should disappear.
Oh, okay, good.
Looks slightly less awkward. So this is another example. First of all, I've changed the map type. I've changed the type to a night pedestrian view like we looked at earlier. But then you'll actually see at the top, you see the address of where I am. This is actually our office in Berlin, in Berlinstraße 115. And the cool thing about, or one of the many cool things about the Map Image API is you can actually use the Geocoder API through the Map Image API. So you don't have to feed in a latitude, longitude. You can actually just feed in an address. And again, I can look at this here in the code.
Yeah.
You'll actually see several parameters. There's CO for country. So I say the address is in Germany. This is just the zoom level. There's CI for city, N for number. And again, I think I've got 2 zoom levels in here. That probably should not be the case. We can save it like this. And it'll actually take this S Invalidenstraße, N 115 and so on, take that, feed that into the geocoder behind the scenes, and then center the map there. And there's a little box that shows you the text as well. So this is really designed in order to highlight addresses on the map. So there's I could go on for half an hour copying things in here. The Map Image API really has a lot of these kind of hidden features, and is really worth looking into and digging into. Maybe we can have a look at the chat. Does anyone have any questions about that? Let's see if there are any. If not, we can kind of move on a little bit. Well, because one thing I don't like about this particular bit of code is that basically we've just thrown all of the parameters into one long URL.
Agreed.
And maybe there's a better way of doing that.
Yeah. So we're using the Azure API call that is essentially our function wrapper to our own APIs. Let's look at the one for the Azure Map Tile where we do have the URL broken out so we can discuss it a little bit more. So in this example, maybe just as a point of reference, if I go back over to the REST map tile, this is without using Azure, we're almost kind of creating the same URL in code down here and then displaying it through Leaflet. We're going to be doing the same thing here. We're still using Leaflet, but instead of calling our API directly, we're now going to be calling it through our Azure. You can see the Azure website's URL here. This is our customized URL that we could copy from the Azure website, place in here, and then of course we can break it out into separate pieces in order to plug in the things that would make it more interesting. So in this example, we're using the base map tile. It's showing reduced night is going to be the color scheme. And we have our code here that we have to use also for this particular call. We construct that entire URL here. You'll notice also that we can change the resolution of the image. This is a PNG 8 where our resolution is changed as well. So that's just kind of interesting that you can affect that as well. And then it's plugged in to our map this way. Let's take a look and see what this looks like in the browser. That's under the Azure Map Tile. And there's that reduced night kind of centered on Phoenix. So do you have another option in code? I'll switch back over to the code view other than reduced night.
Well, usually when somebody asks me this, I actually go to reduced night because that's really kind of a very stylish background you can use kind of for visualization or for just kind of indicating a map if you don't need too much map details and you just want to show some nice markers or something. Sure. But you can just, I think, switch back to normal day or normal night or something like those kind of standard themes. Of course, the documentation has the full list of available map schemes. There's satellite and traffic and really all the kind of things you would imagine. What we're looking at here is still the image-based map tile API, which is also why you could basically set the resolution there. Once you go to the vector tile map tile API, you can actually completely change the way it looks. There are defaults like this still, but you can basically change any color of any feature of the map, show it, hide it in any way you want. So that's kind of really exciting for the vector tile based things. But even in this version, there's a lot of options you can look at in the documentation.
Absolutely. In fact, with you mentioning that, I think it would be good to highlight, let's say, first of all, this was that tutorial view, and at the bottom, it does show some of those different options that you could use, you know, if you were using the leaflet. But I also wanted to go over into our products on our REST APIs, and I'm just going to choose the map image, for example, just to show what Richard was saying. In our documentation, if I click on our REST for our map image and go to examples, then so many of these examples, if I wanted to see a map with, let's say, map with text markers, how could I put text markers out there? This would be that example. So then you can grab, you know, from this MIA16 all the way on, paste it onto your Azure URL, and that would be fully functional, just that way.
So we have a question in chat which basically says, what if the address you are feeding doesn't exist? And I don't know, so I've just changed the code while Michael was talking into just gibberish parameters.
Is that the Azure Map image?
I think, yeah. So okay. I've just changed that to gibberish, and in
voila.
that case, there is no
image for you.
It'll obviously give you a proper return code with an error saying that this doesn't exist. So if you actually look into the response,
yeah,
you get apparently a 404 not found. I'm not sure. It should be that. I'd have to look into that, what exactly the correct error is. But in that case, obviously you can't get an image because there's nothing to give you, and you'd have to handle that.
I love that you challenge if it should be right or not. It was a 404. That's awesome.
Well, I'm not sure that I mean, technically, yeah, the image is not there, so it's not found, but I think it should be something else. So I'll actually look into this afterwards because I'm nerdy like that.
Very cool. And so where was it? Yeah, just right here. So is there any other questions, by the way, in the chat that we should address?
Let me have a quick look. No, but I think this was actually a very good question because I just learned something about the API myself. So Thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
I think I'm also just going to show quickly through our RESTful APIs, also the map tile. So again, if I go right over to the examples and I start to look at all the different types of examples, you know, again, it comes down to if you see something that begins with the word base here, then just know that you'll have to change that in the code. If you were to download the code, you would change that word here because you can't put it preceding your Azure link, but there's a way that you can essentially append it to the end of this URL so that it gets constructed correctly on the other side. Which does take me, Richard, I want to showcase, if I go to the map, whoops, not this one, the map tile code. This is another reason why you might want to host the call to our API within your own environment. In this example, to this map tile API, there's a series here that's checking the requested URL to see, are we looking for aerial? Are we looking for base? So an example of why you might want to have it hosted, because some might say, why not just call your API directly? Well, of course you can call our API directly. But the reason why you might want to have it as a serverless function is one, you can bind all of your clients to one central API and be in complete control of that signature of that API call. So it reduces breaks, you know, across multiple changes, or you'd be in more control. But another thing too is that you can implement some validating business logic. So in this example, maybe I don't want to support a certain type of tile for the app, you know, or restrict it to a certain amount. I could actually do that business logic in here. And I can also do some polishing of some of the data. Maybe there's a lot of ranges that would be available within our query parameters to the API call, but maybe as a business you want to restrict it down to some things that would just make sense for your application. So I just wanted to highlight that so that everybody knew that this would be another reason why you'd want to go in here and possibly change some of the code.
You could possibly also change the response of what comes back, right?
Oh yeah.
So a nice example that goes back to the question from earlier would be if you wanted in those cases to have basically a default image returned instead of a 404, that would be something you could do through the Azure functions as well, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Cool.
Any kind of error that would happen within the Azure function, you'd be in total control of how to handle that error to any of the calling clients.
Yeah, so you could handle that on the Azure side and have a nicer experience on the sort of end application side as well.
Absolutely. So again, to kind of recap, I just want to walk through some of these pages and discuss what is Azure and what is not. So first of all, if it's a client-side HTML SDK call that's entirely using our stuff, well, there's no need to really use, you're not using something within Azure, but it could be that you created an Azure website and this is how that website looks. So, but there's no specific calls to any Azure resources in there. It's just our calls to our APIs. Same here with this REST map image. We're just calling our RESTful API, creating the URL, and then assigning that to the source of the image that is on the screen, which is just called map image down here. So after it's constructed, and as you said before, Richard, since it's just returning an image, that's why we can go ahead and set that source to it. Then, same thing here, we're saying, okay, we're going to use the leaflet rendering engine and supply to it our map tiles. We did that by placing in our API call, our RESTful API from here. Where things got different is when we went to the Azure images. You provided multiple images for people to download from our GitHub account when we're done today. But again, once you have that URL, and you get that because each URL, and I'll just show that once again, each URL has a get function URL link at the top. You click on that, that's that URL that you're going to be calling, and that's what we have in here. You can see it repeated many times, but what changes, of course, Richard, is what we want to make different, just like we do with our normal API. And that's the beauty, is you're using the same parameters as you do with our standard API.
And really all in the default version, in the default code that gets created, all that really happens is your request gets forwarded to the Here API, gets answered, and then handed back to you. Now you have the option through Azure to do all kinds of changes to it, limitations, return something completely different, do business logic on what comes back from the Here APIs, and just give one very specific response, so you don't have to wade through all of that JSON on the client side. All these kind of things you can do, but basically it just gets forwarded, and you just have the convenience of accessing it entirely through the Azure Marketplace and through Azure Functions.
Yes, very good. And then lastly, we talked about this Azure Map Tile. And again, it was still using leaflets, still doing the same thing as we plugged in before. The only difference now is that that base URL came from our Azure function, which was uniquely identified with this URL that we copied, and we're now supplying it there. And when we go back to our pages that are showing these, this is an example of each one of those calls being done all the way to the Azure Map Tiles. So that is essentially how you can get map imagery or map tiles into your applications. And notice that most of these, with the exception of the first one, which is the JavaScript API, can be used in any kind of client call that can do RESTful calls.
Yeah, you can do that. I mean, on an IoT device, the maps only make sense if that IoT device has a screen. But I think we'll be looking throughout the series at a lot of other APIs where that would make a lot of sense to just call it on an IoT device. I've used our APIs on watches, smart watches, my Garmin watches, and so on, where that works really, really well.
Cool. Well, is there any other possible comments or questions from our chat that we need to address at this time?
Let me have a look. I think people are waving at you. They're saying hi to you. Nick says we should do some shameless plugs. I'll leave that to you.
Okay, well, we can go to our back to our normal screen. Nick calls it "go to big heads, Peter," which I think is kind of strange. But yes, yeah, into that mode. So, Richard, here's the thing. There are some shameless plugs. First of all, this was episode 1 of the series. The next episode of this series will happen on October 4th, and it is going to be totally on geocoding. So that doesn't sound like it's exciting, but I'm going to make it exciting. I think it's going to be a fun episode. Hopefully you can join. If you can't, I'll have to have some other mysterious guests join me for that episode. But I'm glad you were able to join today. And by the way, Richard, we should note to everybody, let me see. It is almost 9 p.m. in where you're at. So thank you so much for staying up late and being with us on this episode. So that was Shameless Plug 1. Did you have any shameless plugs you wanted to share?
Not really. I mean, I'll be at DroidCon Lisbon next week. So if you're in town and you want to talk about our mobile SDKs, which you may have seen just peeking briefly onto screen in our projects page as Michael was setting that up, that would be a great opportunity to do it. If not, we'll also be at some other DroidCons later in the year in London and in Chennai. So there's other opportunities. But if you want to meet in person, we're always at a lot of events, and that's the next one I'm going to. So I'm going to shamelessly plug that.
That's awesome. So keep in mind that these episodes, of course, they're live, but they only remain on Twitch for a little while, but then we migrate them over to our YouTube channel. So when we share our GitHub link with you, that main page, that README page at GitHub also has a link to that channel where you can watch all the previous episodes of our live streams, including waypoints, AWS Connections XYZ, and also Azure Connections. If you still have any questions, we invite you to join our Slack channel. And also we're on Twitter. So at HereDev, singular, is where you can find our general Here development announcements for all the developers on our platform. You could also find Dr. Richard Süselbeck at twitter.com/SUESELBECK.
I really need a catchier Twitter handle, don't I?
I think it's good. And
also note that Michael keeps calling me doctor just to make me uncomfortable, and it's working.
Hey, he earned it. I think it's awesome. We got a doctor in the house today. And then also twitter.com/Palermo4 if you want to find my rantings and ravings there. We do have an episode pretty much every Wednesday. I don't recall what next week's is. Hopefully I'll have an inner voice in my head let me know next week. But if I don't have next week, I know that nothing for next week, but we're going to have one, I believe, on the 18th that is going to be an episode that's going to walk through. It's on our Azure or our AWS connection series. It's going to be a walkthrough of one of the more complex tutorials that we put together. And so we hope that you can join us again there for AWS Connections on the 18th of September. Please follow this channel and also make sure to look at any of those missed episodes. Is there anything else you think I may have missed, Richard?
I don't know. I mean, I got to shamelessly plug my next event that I'm doing. You made me excited about the next Twitch episode we're doing on the 18th. I think we're all looking forward to the next Azure one in early October. And so I think that's it.
Very good. We want to thank everyone who joined on our episode today. Thank you so much for joining us live. And keep in mind that you can also view this again very soon at our YouTube channel, which is at our GitHub link, which we did share. Thanks again. Thank you, Richard, for staying up late with us tonight from Berlin.
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me here.
Absolutely. And that's going to be a wrap for our first episode of Azure Connections.
Bye-bye.